At the very least, organizations now need to be measuring their emissions. Now, this becomes quite complicated because emissions are broken out into 3 different scopes: Scope 1, Scope 2, Scope 3. Very imaginative titles, but there you go. But these Scope 1 and Scope 2 are the emissions that an organization are directly responsible for. Scope 3 are the emissions associated with a company's supply chain. The challenge for most organizations is, for the majority of companies, the Scope 3 emissions from their suppliers make up about 80 to 90% of their total emissions.
Thank you so much for joining another edition of The Never-Ending Climb for a Stronger Supply Chain and Procurement for companies running SAP. Today, we have Tom Raftery. Tom is a sustainability and technology evangelist, keynote speaker, and podcast host. He runs 2 podcasts that I would encourage all of you to go check out: The Sustainable Supply Chain and Climate Confident. Tom, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for inviting me, Sean. Really appreciate it.
So I think sustainability is a term that gets thrown around a lot. And for some people, it's been more of a glossy or, a little insert with their annual report, or, some sustainability teams even report into marketing for all the good that's going to do. Tell me, what are you seeing in well-run organizations that have a genuine sustainability function that's making a difference?
Yeah, great question. You're absolutely right. Sustainability is something that organizations, the more forward-looking ones, have been looking at for over 10 years now. Not always for the right reasons, I want to say. As you alluded to, sometimes the CSO, the Chief Sustainability Officer, reports into the Chief Marketing Officer. And, as you said, that kind of tells its own story. That was more the norm back in the noughties, when people started taking this seriously. I think a lot of the larger companies at least started taking this seriously in around the noughties. You had Timberland were one of the first companies, and Patagonia as well, that were reporting their emissions back in the early 2000s. And then you had Al Gore coming along with The Inconvenient Truth in 2006, 2007, and you had an uptick in interest in sustainability. And a lot of organizations started creating their CSR reports then, which, were often, as you said, the glossy PDF that came along with the annual report. But things have changed a lot in the meantime. And so I think particularly as a consequence of the climate accord in Paris in 2015, things are starting to get serious now. Countries and regions are starting to set emissions targets, which are going to be, in some cases, highly, highly ambitious. Yeah, I'm based out of Spain, originally Irish, but I've been living in Spain since 2008. And the EU has a target of reducing its emissions 55% by 2030 against its 1990 baseline. Now, those are just numbers, meaningless without a bit of context. So to give that a little bit of context, we've already reduced our emissions 24% against that baseline. So that leaves 31% to go between now and 2030. That 24% was reduced over the last couple of decades with gradual improvements. But we have to get 31% out in the next less than 6 years. It's less than 6 years now to 2030. And to kind of try and put some scale on this, during the pandemic, when all businesses were shut down in 2020, we dropped our emissions 7%. And then in 2021, as we started opening up businesses again, the emissions went back up 5%. So between 2020 and 2021, we had a net reduction of 2%. Now between 2024 and 2030, we got to get them down 31%. And that's not an aim.
We're running out of time, aren't we? Literally and figuratively.
Exactly. That's not a speculative aim. That's a mandated reduction for all 27 countries of the EU. So this is going to take a lot of heavy lifting. And so organizations are going to be increasingly mandated to get their emissions down. Now, your original question, which I've kind of wandered away from for a second, I'll try and bring it back now. Um, Increasingly, the more forward-looking organizations are now starting to take this more and more seriously. You'll find in some organizations now the chief sustainability officer reports into no longer the CMO, but now the CFO, chief financial officer. And that's because the rigor that's now being started to be applied to sustainability reporting and increasingly will be applied to sustainability reporting will require the same kind of rigor as financial reporting. There's all kinds of regulations coming through in that. So, the CSRD is one of the big ones here in Europe, but the SEC are looking into it as well. They've put out a position paper on it, a request for comment from the public. They still haven't given out the rules, but it's looking like they will be requiring companies to report their emissions. And in time, if not in the next year or two, shortly thereafter, these reports will be required to be audited as well, similarly to financial statements. So this is becoming, if only for regulatory reasons, it's starting to become serious. But obviously, there's a lot more reasons for it as well.
I like the way it starts to move towards something that can show up on the balance sheet.
Mm-hmm.
We talk about sometimes technical debt and custom code can be a liability.
Yeah.
And it can also be an asset depending on how effective it is or what sort of strategic advantage it gives you. Sustainability feels like it's moving very much in the same way, where there's, I know, work underway to craft a home for the liabilities and potential implications of these things showing up on the balance sheet. And I know that's one of those ways to really make it matter to all of the different levels of public sector, private sector, etc. This makes me feel like organizations need to be thinking about the basics, right? I'm a big fan of get the basics right, and then you can build on that. Make sure you've got
Yeah.
a solid foundation. And that makes me think about the things that in your experience, what does a company need to make sure they're doing today at minimum so that they're not already behind?
Yeah, it's a tough one. It depends on the organization size, it depends on the organization, it depends on the industry, it depends on the region, et cetera, et cetera. But at the very least, organizations now need to be measuring their emissions. Now, this becomes quite complicated because emissions are broken out into three different scopes: scope one, scope two, scope three. Very imaginative titles, but there you go. But the scope one and scope two are the emissions that an organization are directly responsible for. Scope three are the emissions associated with a company's supply chain. The challenge for most organizations is, for the majority of companies, the scope three emissions from their suppliers make up about 80 to 90% of their total emissions. So if you're measuring your scope one and scope two and you're doing really well and you're getting close to zero, fantastic. That's only 10 to 20% of your actual emissions. So the question was, what should companies be doing? The very first thing they should be doing, if they're not doing it already, is measuring your emissions, scope one, scope two, and scope three. To measure your emissions for scope three, you need to be going out to your suppliers and asking them what are the emissions associated with your purchases from them. And then you're at the mercy of how sophisticated their emissions reporting systems are. Now, there's lots of ways to deal with this if they don't have a sophisticated reporting mechanism in place for their emissions. Sometimes, they'll kind of go, stick their finger in the air and go 42. and
It's a great answer for all kinds of things.
there you go. But you need your emissions reporting to be accurate. And so it depends on your relationship with your supplier. It depends on whether they've got competitors who are more sophisticated in their reporting mechanisms or not. Do you want to move? Do you want to work with your current supply base? There's a whole spectrum there of ways to deal with that. I know of one US based theme park, for example, and they've actually hired a team of consultants to go out to all of their suppliers at the theme park's expense to get their suppliers' emissions down. And that's kind of one extreme. The other extreme is just to kind of, you know, cut off suppliers who are not working with you to get their emissions down. That's another extreme. In the middle, you've got a whole spectrum of ways of working with your suppliers. There are several companies now, Greenly is one, for example, and their whole business model is to go to large organizations and say, roll us out to all of your suppliers and we'll help them report their emissions into you. So there's lots of different ways of doing it. But you need to be getting accurate reporting from your suppliers. And then if there are problem suppliers or suppliers with higher emissions, you need to make a judgment call there. Do you want to continue working with them? Do you want to work with them to get their emissions down? How do you want to do that? How important are they? Do they have competitors who are doing better? There's, like I said, there's a whole range of approaches to take there. So there's two main things: get your own emissions down and get the emissions from your supply base down, which is actually the bigger chunk of your emissions typically, and the harder one to get down, the harder one to get accurate reporting on, and the harder one to get down. So it's a big challenge. It's a big challenge for organizations. These things are not easy. If they were, we wouldn't be here talking about it, I guess. It would be all done at this point. It is becoming more and more important. There's more pressure coming from all sides on organizations to get their emissions down.
My sense is it really gets down to brass tacks, if you will, when the CFO or the CEO or a board member is going to be asked to sign their signature to certify that the report is true and accurate.
Yeah, no, because there's new legislation been passed recently in the EU saying that organizations that are seen or perceived to be greenwashing are liable for that. So this is perceived now as a crime similar to financial fraud in the EU, at least. Analogous to is probably a better way of putting it. So, and there's going to be more and more regulations like that as well. So, yeah, directors, CEOs, whoever's signing off on this need to be very, very careful that they're not perceived to be or are not greenwashing, that the signature there says that, yes, this is actually accurate. And whether you get auditors in to do third-party auditing on it as well to make sure, that's probably a good idea too.
I think that's one of the things that we're just starting to see from what I've heard is third-party auditors coming in to take a look at how those numbers are calculated. I know for some organizations, they're still building a category management strategy and they're still just working on getting contracted prices in place with their suppliers. And the idea of now adding on top of that, collecting emissions for the materials and products and services and so on that they're buying starts to feel really, really daunting. For these organizations, what would you suggest they start with if they're just getting going?
So there are a number of companies that help organizations who are starting out. I mentioned the company Greenly earlier. Their tagline is they say they are the fresh books of carbon accounting. Now, there's others. Normative is another one that works closely with lots of companies. There's lots of them out there who make it simple for smaller organizations who might be reporting into larger companies typically. Because, as I said, larger companies have been doing this typically for quite a while, but it's now starting to be pushed out to the supply base. And so smaller companies are starting to be asked increasingly to do this. There are lots and lots of companies now who have platforms in place to help companies do this, particularly smaller companies. If you are being asked by one of your customers to supply this information and it's not something you've done before, maybe talk to your customer and ask them, do they have a recommendation for a platform to use? Because if they have one and you're working with that, the chances are it'll make the reporting that much easier, because you don't want to have a situation where you have 15, 20 customers all asking you to use different platforms, and that's just a nightmare scenario. So you want to poll your customers, find out which one the majority of them are interested in you using, if they are, and then make sure that whichever platform you decide to go for is capable of programmatically reporting back into possibly the ERP systems of your customers.
Super, super helpful. I think setting some targets is one of those things, whether it's at the beginning of the year, people think, hey, I want to lose some weight. It's like, oh, that's great. That's utterly useless. We want to reduce emissions. Great. That's utterly useless. And the parallels are so many. And I think one of the things that we were talking about before is what setting targets can look like and how granular you're seeing people winning at this are setting those targets. Can you share a little more for us?
Yeah. So obviously, in any project like this, your first goal is to measure your actual current emissions. And then when you've got that baseline, you can start thinking about targets to set. There's an organization called the Science Based Targets Initiative, and they are set up specifically, they're nonprofit, they're set up specifically to work with organizations, to work with industries, to help them set, as the name implies, science based targets. And if you as a company are saying, yeah, I've set these targets, that's one thing. But if you can say, no, I've set science based targets in line with the Science Based Targets Initiative, that gives you kind of a stamp of approval that will help you with your customers. They'll go, oh, okay, I can take this guy's word for it here that this is the genuine, the real deal. And of course, the Science Based Targets Initiative do report out on everyone who is using their methodologies and how, because you are assessed on it. So you can't just make it up and say, oh, yeah, no, I'm using the SBTI. No. Well, you can say it, but you'll be found out quickly enough if you try and you're not. So
Yeah.
you actually have to not just say you're doing it, but actually do it as well. Now, I mean, you can decide initially, I'll go without that and hope your customers will be happy enough with that. But really, best practice would be to look at the SBTI, look at their recommendations and follow those as best you can.
That's brilliant. I think this brings us down to one of these sort of natural questions where if you're in the EU right now, as opposed to large parts of North America, I think there's already enough regulatory differences and maturity differences between these two environments.
Mm-hmm.
But in general, for companies that are running SAP and they're large enough that they're running this larger version of SAP, how close to that like bleeding edge on this do you feel we are, as opposed to kind of early adopter and becoming general? Where do you think we are on that kind of a curve?
This is one of those questions where the answer is it depends. There's no yes, no response to this. So it depends on, as you said, the region, but it also depends on the size of the organization. It depends on the industry they're in. If you're a utility company, if you're a cement manufacturer or a steel manufacturer, these regulations have been in place for decades and you've been reporting for decades. If you're a fossil fuel company, similar. But if you own a hardware store, no one has ever asked you for your carbon emissions unless you own a chain of, 2,000 hardware stores. You get my point. So it's very much a spectrum. And what I would say is, because these regulations are coming down, And it depends on the region and which regulations. California has already put out regulations, and there's going to be more to come. The SEC are going to be putting out regulations. They've already put out position papers or requests for comment. These are coming. The sooner you act on this, very much the better, because you know it's coming. So do your competitors. There are lots of people looking at this who are interested in how companies are performing. It could be your bank. It could be your insurance company. It could be your shareholders, if you have shareholders. It could be your employees, your customers. You know, all these people are starting to look into this now. Customers, as we've talked about already, are looking for lower carbon suppliers. Employees are looking to work for organizations that have a good sustainability story to tell. So right there, those are two stakeholders that you want to be attracting. You want to keep your costs of recruitment and retention down. You want to be attracting customers and keeping customers. Again, same thing. Shareholders are starting to look at this as well. So again, if you are publicly traded, this is going to become increasingly important for you. I mentioned banks and insurance companies. Banks are now starting to be similarly judged on the emissions in their loan book, for example. So they are starting to favor companies that have lower emissions. So if you have lower emissions, you'll find it easier to raise capital and cheaper to raise capital. Similarly, for insurance companies, they're being rated on the emissions of their customers. So again, insurance should be easier to get and should be lower cost if you are a lower emissions company. So, that's a whole lot of stakeholders, and that's not taking the regulations into effect at all or into account at all. So there are lots and lots and lots of reasons to do this, and the sooner the better. And if you're one of the people who decide to push it back and leave it, because the regulations haven't come out yet in your area, if you wait for that, then the struggle to get consultants as you rush to get your emissions accounted for will be challenging. Those consultants today are few and far between and expensive. They're not going to get any cheaper, as you're scrambling to get in place for some kind of regulatory deadline. So the sooner you do it, the better. If you're one of the people who leave it till late, you'll be struggling, as I said, to get consultants, but you'll also have issues with losing customers. And that's going to be a world of pain for a lot of people, I think.
Yeah, that double whammy of the proverbial skills apocalypse. Very much like all the companies that are still on ECC trying to get to S4 before the deadline in 2027. You don't want to be the company trying to find good quality consultants in 2026. Yeah. So the idea of waiting until the deadline is forced upon you is one way to do it, but it might not work the way you hope it will. Tom, this is brilliant. And the angle of the whole world of sustainability, and I say world from my heart, especially as somebody whose whole family spends as much time as we possibly can out in the mountains, and we take our vacations places where all-inclusive is kind of what you bring with you, usually in a backpack or a kayak or something like that. And I love the way this effort by a concerted group of people, making sure that you are not the last mover, making sure that you are at least with the median as this is moving through. It's so brilliant. And I thank you for bringing this on a weekly basis to the world with your podcasts. And thank you very much for joining me this week. Tom, thanks again. For people that want to find your material, find your podcasts, if you can take a moment, just share with everybody the best way to find you and your podcasts online, or if they want you as a keynote speaker, it's the best way to find you.
I guess there's lots of ways. I'm on social media. I'm all over social media. I'm on LinkedIn, Threads, Twitter. I'm not on Facebook. So just search for me by name, Tom Raftery. You'll find me on any of the above. The podcasts are, to your point, the Sustainable Supply Chain podcast. So that goes out every Monday morning. That is available on all podcast channels and YouTube. So just search for sustainable supply chain and it'll come up straight away. The Climate Confident podcast, similar, goes out every Wednesday. You'll find that on any of the podcast applications. Just search for Climate Confident. It'll come straight up straight away. And they're both available on YouTube. So I published the video on YouTube as well in parallel. So they're easy enough to find. Also, if you want, there's a site called Linktree, and Linktree/Tom Raftery will give you all the links to my newsletter, my website with the blog, podcasts, etc., etc., etc.
Amazing. Tom, thanks again so much for showing up and helping share this with the world and for joining us this week. And this has been another edition of The Never-Ending Climb for a Stronger Supply Chain and Procurement for companies running SAP. And if you are looking to level up Procure to Pay on SAP, we've got an add-on you really need to check out. Thanks so much, everybody.
Thanks, Sean, for inviting me, and thanks, everyone, for listening.